President Trump yesterday hit on many of the things he campaigned on, and he took action on many of the things that he campaigned on. What stuck out to you out of all of the action that he took on day one?
The two big things that struck me more than anything else were in regard to his pardoning or commutation of approximately 1,600 criminal cases involving the January 6th rioters, and then his attempt to define birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment. As a constitutional law scholar, that was pretty notable for me, even if it didn't attract as much attention in the broader public discourse.
Yeah, some of the other kind of not so consequential things got a lot of attention. You know, Gulf of America, Mount McKinley, that sort of thing. But explain the birthright, the Constitution, and can he actually do what he tried to do yesterday?
Short answer is probably not. Basically, what he did is he signed an executive order. An executive order is how you direct a government agency to interpret the law and the Constitution. But he's only one of the three branches of government. There's also the legislature and there's the judiciary. He basically said, look, I'm not disputing that people born in the United States generally are going to be U.S. citizens by birth. Which I will say is a minority practice legally worldwide. Very few countries do what the United States does when it comes to birthright citizenship. He said, however, there are certain categories of people who may be born in the United States, but we will not interpret them as U.S. citizens by birth. The two that he said in particular were, one, individuals who are born here of people who have parents who are not U.S. citizens, and the mother, when she gives birth in the United States, is here on a student visa, a vacation, maybe as a refugee, those types of scenarios where they are not here as a permanent resident. That's the first one. Trump said that we will not consider that person a U.S. citizen, that child a U.S. citizen. The second one is people where the mother or the mother and father are here illegally. They are unauthorized to be in the United States. They've overstayed their work visa or their vacation visa, but the legal argument is taken themselves outside of the jurisdiction of the United States, because that's what the 14th Amendment says. Anyone subject to the jurisdiction of the United States who is born here is a U.S. citizen. So they say, well, if you're intentionally dodging law enforcement and immigration authorities, you're trying to avoid the jurisdiction of the United States, so you're not going to get the privileges thereof. The problem is, historically, immigration authorities and the federal courts have not interpreted birthright citizenship that way. They've said that if you're born in the United States, regardless of the status of your parents, if you are born here, then you are a U.S. citizen.
Seems cut and dry.
You would think it would be cut and dry, but I will say there are some constitutional scholars who do adopt the Trump administration's position. One of them is one of Donald Trump's former attorneys, John Eastman. He's where I first encountered that legal theory. And then there was a former judge on the Seventh Circuit, Richard Posner, who said, in so many words, I don't personally share this view that if you're here illegally and have a child, that child is not a U.S. citizen. But at the very least, there's a strong policy argument about that. And it's not a kooky legal theory. It's a distinctly minority position in academia, but I could find some legal scholars who would embrace that position.
Robert Bolton is with us, professor, Fairmont State political scientist. Robert, it took about 2 hours last night for a lawsuit to be filed on this. I think the ACLU also filed an action. What's next? Does this just end up at the Supreme Court and they make a ruling based on the executive order? And then I guess the question becomes, will Trump ignore the Supreme Court?
If he would ignore the Supreme Court, that would obviously bring up certain constitutional questions about potentially whether or not he could be impeached, although he'd probably say, I'm 2-0 right now. But in regard to the Supreme Court, it will definitely be heard by the federal court system. Typically, the Supreme Court doesn't want to touch on these hot topic legal issues until the lower courts and multiple circuits have ruled on it. And even then, they usually won't rule on it unless there's a circuit split. So, for example, West Virginia, we're in the Fourth Circuit. Let's say that the Fourth Circuit upheld Trump's definition of birthright citizenship. And then a judge in New York, which is the Second Circuit, says, no, that's constitutionally impermissible. Then at that point, the Supreme Court's probably going to have to intervene. The big problem is the Supreme Court's never ruled on this exact legal issue. There's a case from the 19th century involving Chinese immigrants, Wan Kim Ark v. U.S., or U.S. v. Wan Kim Ark is the technical title. And in that case, it involved a Chinese man whose parents were here as permanent residents, and it was determined he had U.S. citizenship. But we've never had the exact legal question of two people who are non-citizens and are both here illegally. I tend to think eventually the federal courts are going to have to work their way through this. If the Supreme Court does end up hearing a case involving this, it's going to be at least a couple of years out. You will not see something involving the Supreme Court anytime during this term or next term, which starts in October. It will be at least 2 or 3 years.
Robert, I want to transition. When you take a look at Federalist 69, Hamilton outlines limitations on pardons, one being no pardon in impeachment cases. He emphasizes that the president can't use the pardon of power to obstruct the impeachment process. That limitation ensures that presidents can't shield themselves from action improperly. I'm wondering, in this day and age, if a president cannot pardon themselves, seemingly an act of a king, should they be allowed to pardon family members, as former President Biden did yesterday?
Well, touching on that, actually, there's a pretty strong legal argument on whether or not the president can pardon himself, because there would be an argument, could Donald Trump, the president, pardon Donald Trump, the tax-paying citizen? I actually do happen to have the opinion that the president could probably pardon himself, although I recognize that's probably the minority view among legal scholars, but it's pretty closely 50-50 split on that issue. In regard to family members, as it stands right now from a constitutional perspective, I don't think that there's any legitimate or substantial constitutional argument against a president pardoning family members or close friends or supporters. There have been a number of instances in the past where presidents of both parties have pardoned or commuted the sentences of supporters or family members. Donald Trump did that with his son-in-law, Jared Kushner's father-in-law or father. Bill Clinton famously pardoned his brother, Roger Clinton, from cocaine trafficking issues. Generally, from a constitutional perspective, the only three meaningful restrictions in regard to the president's pardon power are: one, the president cannot pardon an impeachable offense. So he could avoid criminal liability for a supporter, such as a member of his cabinet, but that person could still be impeached and removed from office by Congress. The second one is that the president's pardon power does not immunize the person who's pardoned from state prosecution. So if I would commit a crime, say in West Virginia, that's both a federal and state offense, and the president pardoned me, I would be immune from being prosecuted at the federal level, but state authorities could still pursue me. The third restriction is in regard to, and this is somewhat debated, but again, the vast majority of legal scholars say it doesn't encompass this. The president cannot pardon civil or administrative liability. So if you fail to pay your taxes, for example, maybe the president can pardon you from the tax evasion criminal charges, but you still have to pay your taxes civilly.
What precedent does this set moving forward? The pardons, especially the preemptive pardons that President Biden issued on his way out, on the way out of office.
Well, even the people who were subject to the pardon were pretty ambivalent about it, because historically acceptance of a pardon has constituted an admission of guilt in the federal court system. That was the big argument Gerald Ford made when he pardoned Richard Nixon, trying to get this country past Watergate. He said, well, by Nixon accepting the pardon, he was admitting his guilt. The Supreme Court's never explicitly ruled on that. Those have always been lower court opinions. I do think in regard to that it does create some concern, especially for the people who are pardoned, that as I noted, the acceptance of a pardon is an admission of liability. So let's say you're a member of Jack Smith's legal team and you do accept that pardon because you don't want to be criminally harassed. Well, someone may file an ethics complaint with you with the state bar of wherever you're a member of, or say it could open you up to civil liability. The other big issue is by accepting a pardon, what do you lose? You lose your ability to avoid self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment, your right to remain silent. So say I was suing you in some situation related to this, but criminal charges have not been filed. You could potentially invoke your Fifth Amendment right to help limit your testimony in court in any civil case to avoid future criminal prosecution. If you've accepted a pardon, you no longer have that luxury.
Robert Bolton joining us. He's Fairmont State University political science professor. What are you interested to watch over the next 4 years from this Trump administration?
I particularly am interested in his approach to foreign nations, both in regard to tariffs and our broader military commitments abroad. Trump has, compared to the Biden administration, have embraced a relatively soft-footed approach into whether or not we're going to support Ukraine in its current conflict with Russia, and then also in regard to his attitude towards tariffs. Donald Trump is really the first president in, oh my goodness, probably 60 or 70 years who's given a full-throated endorsement of tariffs as a major tool of economic policy for the United States in its diplomatic relations with other nations. And he said that he would potentially want to impose tariffs on any imported good, but especially those from countries that may be hostile to the United States or that he perceives giving us a raw deal. Now, there are some nations where that may be justified, such as China, where they have engaged in duplicitous trade practices in the past, but it also could potentially impact close allies of the United States like Canada and Mexico. So it'll be interesting to see his approach to that.
Robert Bolton, Fairmont State University political science professor. Robert, thanks for braving the cold and coming to the studio this morning, buddy.
I'm glad to enjoy it, Dave.